Ask yourself frequently, what is the goal of your work or the work you do and who is it serving? Not to say that you always need to know exactly where you're going, but I think it's good to have a north and that the good north is supporting an economy that enables everyone to live a meaningful life.
Hey there, fellow Rethinker. Welcome back to the Rethinking Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Magalí Brosio. Magalí is a Global Challenges Scholar at the University of Birmingham. She is a feminist scholar and discusses feminist economics with us in this episode. We learn about inclusivity and diversity and the many aspects of feminist economics. Not only that, we go back to the basics of it, as it is sometimes still an unknown topic and field. Magalí will teach you all about it though, so let's dive into the conversation. Thank you for rethinking with us. Hey Magalí, welcome to the Rethinking Podcast. It's so nice to have you on. What have you been up to?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. As a PhD student, I'm always up to working on my dissertation, but we will talk hopefully more on that soon, I guess.
Yeah, so maybe it's best to first introduce you. What do you do?
So I would start by saying that I'm a feminist economist, or at least I do research in the broad field of feminist economics. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, where I'm a global challenges scholar.
A global challenges scholar? What does that include?
So that's actually a really good question. And I guess it's a question I had myself when I first applied to this program. So I guess it makes sense for me to give you some background about my own experience before going back to school, as I said. As I mentioned before, I consider myself a feminist economist, but this was not always the case, although I have been a feminist for all of my life. I mean, I have fought for gender equality, for women's rights, but I saw that as a separate issue than my academic or professional work as an economist. So I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, where I come from. I studied economics. Just a footnote on like the university system or the higher education system in Argentina. This is quite different from the US and from my experience from most of European countries because we have very long undergraduate degrees, like 5 or 6 years, and they're very focused on one topic. So for instance, I did economics, and that means I took like 30 something courses only on economics. So it's very intensive. Yeah, you live like with a very strong and comprehensive, I guess, foundation. And during that time, I was exposed to, I would say, a wide array of heterodox perspectives, but not feminist economics. There was no course on gender and economics, no content of gender and economics in any courses whatsoever. That has changed. They do have one now. It's not enough, but it's such an important step. But the thing is that at that moment, I didn't know how to be a feminist economist because I didn't know that feminist economics existed at all. At the same time, I was also working as a research assistant, a research center, focusing mostly on, I guess, industrial policy and labor markets. And I decided that I liked the latter better and I wanted to focus on that. So I decided to study a master's degree that was focused on on labor economics. And I found this program kind of designed by the International Labor Organization, the ILO, on applied labor economics that is delivered by the University of Turin in Italy and the Sciences Po in France. During my master's, I kind of started to hear a little bit more about women and how, like, what's the participation of women in the economy or what's the status of women in the economy, but not quite there yet, I would say. Very, very narrowly defined, not very well mainstream into the content. And at the same time, I would say I've always been an avid Twitter user. So being away from my home, I was using Twitter more and more to stay connected with friends, but also like with my networks. And I came across a couple of male economists saying like, oh, well, there's no such thing as a gender wage gap. Like I ran all of their regressions and that's not there. There's not that. I was like, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about your methodology? And he was like, no, that's very simple. Everyone knows how to do that. And I was like, well, I'm writing a master thesis on critical perspectives on how to do this, but whatever, if you say it doesn't exist, I guess. So a colleague and myself, we decided to write something. We were like, okay, we need to do something about this. So we decided to do some research because we didn't know, as I said, we didn't study this at school. So we didn't know a lot about this. So we did a little bit of research about by ourselves. We went to like read a lot of ILO reports, a lot of UN Women reports, and we were like very surprised about the amount of like really interesting, high quality work that was out there. And we didn't know anything about its existence, as economists ourselves. And we were also kind of curious, like, how do other people, I mean, if us who are economists do not know about the existence of all of this information, how do other people know about it? And again, another footnote of our Argentinians and Argentinian culture, it is a very like political and politically aware community, I would say, especially when it comes to economics. I guess it's like kind of the consequence of like the multiple economic crises that we have had in the past. So I would say like the average Argentinian would know like what's the inflation rate or how much is the exchange rate between the pesos and the US dollars, and how that changed in the last years, and how the negotiations with the IMF are going. So everyone is kind of knows what's going on in the economy, but no one knows like what was the female unemployment rate or the gender wage gap. So we saw it was a huge gap right there about information that people were not accessing to. So we kind of wrote a series of articles for the general public about different content about gender inequality in the labor market. And we kind of started a blog called Economía Feminista, or Feminist Economics in Spanish. And I won't bore you with the details, but what started as a blog is now like a very well-established NGO, like formal NGO in Argentina.
Oh, wow.
I'm not part of that organization anymore, but the other person who co-founded that with me, she's now the first national director of the Gender and Economics office in Argentina. So it had a huge impact. And it was such a good experience. And for me, it was also like a life-changing experience in the sense that I decided I want to do this for a living, I don't want to write articles like on Saturday or after my day job. I want to do this for a living. I want to do feminist economics. And luckily for me, I was able to pursue this as an interest at a professional level. I was at that time moving to the United States due to personal reasons, and I found a job for UN Women as a research assistant first, and then at the Center for Women Global Leadership. And we can talk more about what I did there later, but although I learned a lot in those roles, I've learned like a lot, I kind of felt that I needed to go to academia. I felt like I needed to go back because of, well, two reasons, I guess, like more at a personal level. I felt like I needed a more solid background because, as I said, like I didn't get to study this before. And again, a footnote here, I acknowledge that formal education might not be the best or the only way to acquire that solid foundation, but it felt right for me. So I really wanted to have the time to study and go to classes and read by myself and write, etc. And at the same time, I felt like the discipline itself had like some limitations that I think arise in part because they are part of economics, which has a lot of limitations in terms of like boundaries and disciplinary boundaries. And I felt that there was, I don't know, some pushing of the boundaries to be made, and that can only happen within academia. So I really wanted to be part of that, like kind of to be at the forefront of trying to push the boundaries of what feminist economic is and what can be. So I wanted to go back to school, but I ran very quickly into a problem when I started applying for PhD programs that I really didn't know where I fit, because most, as you can probably imagine, most universities do not have like a feminist economics program or even a course. So I found myself kind of applying to like different departments depending on the uni. Like for some unis, I applied to economics, but in others, I applied to social sciences or sociology or even gender studies. So I kind of really, I felt really lost. I didn't know where I belonged or where my research belonged. And then finally, I get to the question that you asked. The global challenges, let's say, kind of emerged as the solution I didn't know I needed. So just to briefly mention this, my university has this program, or more like a funding scheme, where they provide scholarships to doctoral researchers who are working on what they say the world's most pressing challenges. And in most cases, there is a recognition that the complexity of these challenges require interdisciplinary research. So I, for instance, am based in the law department primarily, but I'm also linked to the international development ones. So I get to interact with people with the very diverse backgrounds who give me like feedback so valuable and so enriching for my research. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be doing interdisciplinary research, which I would highly recommend to everyone actually.
Why is interdisciplinary research recommended?
Well, because I think that sometimes we kind of lose sight of what we're doing, and having a perspective that comes from outside can help us kind of redirect. It also helps us with our constraint. I feel like, as I mentioned before, that feminist economics have been so constrained by the disciplinary boundaries of economics, because at the end of the day, I mean, in academia, you have to publish, you have to get a job. I mean, and that means kind of meeting certain like criteria or requirements set by others, even if you don't believe in them. So for many feminist economics, it meant doing a lot of econometrics, for instance, even though they don't see the point. And I kind of question like the amount of time that sometimes we spend trying to conform norms that we don't agree with. And I think that sometimes interdisciplinarity can help with that, can help us get a different perspective, can help meeting people who might have very valuable tools that we're unaware of. I mean, for me, I think it was qualitative research. I mean, I guess as most economists, I knew nothing about qualitative research. I was very, very judgmental about like the scientific quality, I have to admit, about like qualitative research. And now I'm like, I've been converted. I think it's such a powerful tool. There's so many things that we could do if we allowed that to be, more widely accepted in economics. There's so much potential that it's not being exploited because we don't know about that, or we know about that and we think that's not as good as quantitative research. So I think that meeting people from other disciplines, meeting people coming from other spaces who might not have all of those preconceptions about different methodologies or like different limitations, it's very helpful when you're trying to do research at the edges, I would say, of the discipline.
So how did qualitative research change your perspective on research?
Well, I guess it has to do, as I said, of what doing like research means, of what good quality or high quality academic work means. And I think, well, let me rephrase it. So I work a lot on indicators, and we can talk a little bit about my own research later if you want. So my primary area of interest is indicators and how indicators kind of shape the way we think. And I think that the excessive weight that we put on indicators and on things that can be measured and that can be evidence through like a metric or something, it's very limiting. It's very limiting because you cannot measure everything, and that's all right. I mean, I'm totally for more data. I'm totally for better data. I think that's also necessary. So don't get me wrong. But at the same time, I do think that we really have to acknowledge that some things cannot be measured, and that's all right as well. And that doesn't mean these things are not important. That doesn't mean they're not important problems that should be addressed, that should be researched, that should be studied. So I think that the excessive focus on on what can be measured, it's kind of limiting for us.
So what is it like to work in a law department after studying economics for years in a fully economic program?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I had a lot of catching up to do. I won't lie. It was very intimidating, like sitting for seminars and hearing words that I just never heard before. I mean, it's not even that I'm studying in a country that is not my own country, in a language that is not my native language, but also they have a complete different like legal system. So I cannot even draw parallels, say, oh, I understand this word, because I don't understand what that means, because we don't have that back home. So it was very challenging. I also found very hard to, again, explain what I do, because I found that the language that I use, or like the things that I took for granted as like common knowledge are not common, it's not common knowledge for lawyers or for legal scholars. So again, but it helped me being very flexible and understanding like how I can reach like different audiences. And I also learned how to understand better the work of others, even if I'm not 100% familiar or even 10% familiar. I always get something out of that. I always learn something new, and I always get something new for me as well. Like you might say, oh, what can they add to your research that, I mean, the legal component is there, but it's not the primary component. I don't do doctrinal work. I'm not even sure I know what doctrinal work means. But when I hear them, when I hear their feedback on my work, they always have very valuable insights and things that never occurred to me, things that I didn't know, things that were kind of part of my blind spots. I guess we all have blind spots, and I think that the more you get to know people from like different backgrounds and with like different experiences, the more those blind spots are covered.
What were blind spots you had that you didn't know about?
So I guess I had a lot of reconstruction to do in terms of like feminist history. As I said before, I didn't have the chance to study that during my undergrad nor during my master's. So my linkages or my way of learning that was kind of by myself with my books or with friends, talking, attending conferences. But you know, when you study like that, I always feel, I don't know if this is for everyone, but for me it felt like I had the pieces of the puzzle, but I didn't have like the image that I was supposed to emulate with the pieces of my puzzle. So I didn't know how to put them together. So I was kind of wondering like, oh, I have all of this, but where are you? Do you go to the left? Do you go to the right? So I think that with time and hearing others have helped me kind of placing all of these different pieces together.
So before we go into what you research, maybe it's good to start at the beginning, because you might hear what feminism is or feminist economics, but what actually is feminist economics?
So I guess we could discuss this for hours, but I will give you the short answer if we can agree that this is not, I mean, this is just a very like general broad definition. So I would say again that broadly speaking, we can say that feminist economics studies the linkages between economic relations and gender relations, making visible the economic inequalities experienced by women and explaining that this is not an unexpected or accidental byproduct of the economy, that on the contrary, women's economic inequality is instrumental to the economic system in the sense that the system is built on these sustained inequalities. So feminist economics gives words in a way and a language, I would say, to speak about these inequalities. You know, we hear about glass ceilings and sticky floors, gender wage gaps, feminization of poverty. So it gives us a language to speak about these inequalities and tools to articulate them as problems in general, but also as economic problems in particular. So instead of saying that gender inequality, I would say it's a social issue that in turn manifests in the economic realm, feminist economics or feminist economists identify gender inequality as a problem that is economic at its core and that needs to be addressed within the interdisciplinary or the disciplinary boundaries of economics. In addition to that, I would just mention that feminist economics is part of the universe of heterodox economics. They're sometimes overlapping with other areas or other school of thought. So we have, for instance, like Marxist feminist economics or structuralist feminist economics, etc. But we can say that in general, like all feminist economics are heterodox insofar as its starting point for the whole discipline is kind of discussing with orthodox ideas. And feminist economics, from its very beginning, has challenged the ability of neoclassical economics to not only to transform, but even to explain, I would say, the situation of women. I think that in particular, feminist economics would argue that neoclassical economics tools are very limited. It's a very limited theoretical approach because its subject of study is limited and also the tools are gender blind. So the counter proposal finally that emerges from feminist economics is to kind of move away the focus of economics from markets towards, I would say, the sustainability of life. And this logically means kind of broadening the object of study of economics and recognizing other dimensions of the economy that have been frequently and often ignored in a traditional economic analysis, and I would say both in orthodox and heterodox economics. And what dimensions am I referring to? Well, basically those kind of associated with the activities that happen outside of the market, but that are absolutely crucial for the reproduction of the economic system. So perhaps it makes sense for me to briefly speak about the concept of care work if you think that's relevant. So the concept of care work can be, I guess, broadly defined as all the activities and relations that are indispensable for fulfilling the basic needs of every human being, whatever the nature of those needs. Physical needs, psychological needs, emotional needs, etc., and that are related to the existence and the reproduction of absolutely every human being, as I mentioned. So they include both the work that is relational or face-to-face care. So for instance, feeding a baby or feeding an elder person, that's care work, but also doing all of the domestic work that is behind that relational care, that's also care work. So in order to feed a baby, you will have to plan for a meal and buy the groceries and cook the food and then do the dishes. So there's a lot of universal activities, a lot of things that are necessary for the reproduction and the existence of a human being. And while the development of the concept of care is very important in its own right, feminist economics' main contribution, I would say, is connecting it with economic analysis. So the core idea of feminist economics is that care work is not only important for the reproduction of people in the abstract, but that it is crucial for the reproduction of the labor force and as a consequence for the reproduction of the economic system as a whole. And I would add that much of this work is carried out outside of the market, within of the household boundaries, in the form of unpaid care work. And global statistics show that women are in charge of 75% of the hours allocated to these activities. So just to kind of sum up, feminist economics kind of proposes to study what happens in the realm of production in conjunction with what happens in the realm of reproduction, since there are two sides of the same coin and two co-constitutive parts of the economic system.
So then what is the starting point of feminist economics? Is that then the household? Is that then the economic system? Where does feminist economics start from? What's their perspective or their viewpoint?
I guess that's a really difficult question to answer, especially because, as I said, it is a very broad, I would say, school of thought. As I mentioned, for instance, I guess that for Marxist feminist economics might not be the same point as for someone that thinks about themselves most as a neo-Keynesian, post-Keynesian, it's really hard to think about what's the starting point. I guess it depends on other things. I would say that care work is kind of like the thread that runs around everyone. It's kind of like the minimum unit or the starting point, and then you see how that affects all of the other universe or how that permeates in the rest of the economic system. I do think that labor economics in a way has been kind of an entry point to kind of start doing feminist economics, mostly because we had data on that. So it was easy to kind of start analyzing the labor market, and it is very easy to notice all of the gender inequalities that still prevail in the labor market. So we see that worldwide women have been entering like in huge amount like labor markets for many years, but we still see a lot of prevailing inequalities. You know, when you see the numbers worldwide, you see that in any country, unemployment rates would be higher for women, underemployment rates would be higher for women, same with informality rates. We see gender wage gaps prevailing in every country. We see horizontal segregation, we see vertical segregation, etc. We see gender-based violence in the world of work affecting mostly women. So there's a lot of inequality that, again, could be measured and could be demonstrated So I think it has been a really good entry point for feminist economics to say, okay, there's a lot of things, there is a prevailing and undeniable, let's say, gender inequality in the labor market. How are we going to address it? So it's been a very helpful entry point to other topics later on.
You said before gender blind tools, and I was wondering what that meant or what those are.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So a point this could be the answer to the previous question. One good point of departure for feminist economics would be acknowledging that men and women do not have the same position in the economy. They do not have the same position in the productive sphere because they do different type of jobs, they receive different type of benefits for their jobs and different wages, etc. So they don't have the same position. And they also don't have the same position in the reproductive sphere because, again, they do most of the unpaid care work. So they don't have the same position in the economy. Considering that the starting point, it is very logical to assume that neither economic phenomena, neither economic policy will affect them in the same way. And what feminist economists say is that if you don't acknowledge the gender differences between men and women, if you don't take this into account when you are designing and implementing policies, then you're applying gender blind. Your policies will not be gender neutral, they will be gender blind, and they might even worsen the situation of women because they are not acknowledging that there is an unequal point of departure. One example that they have used a lot is when you're designing, for instance, your social security system. If your social security system assumes that the male experience is the norm and that most people have a formal job, then a lot of women will not benefit from it because a lot of women work informally, a lot of women leave the labor market to, take on care responsibilities. So that's not like the average, the normal experience for women. But when you take the male experience as the norm, you kind of design these tools that are supposed to be gender neutral, but the reality is that they assume one experience as the normal and the other one as the bias. And the thing is that if your social security system is only designed, for instance, around unemployment benefits that only benefit those who had previous employment history, that have had a previous formal job, you will be leaving out a lot of women who are contributing to the economy, just in a way that it's invisible to your assumptions.
So does feminist economics then start from the female point of view, or does feminist economics put both men and women next to each other? How does that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it starts from the female experience. I guess so I would say that the starting point is assuming that everyone has a gender and that gender affects their experiences and affects their status, and that you should take into account. And then that is further, of course, complicated with other identities and other like intersectional analysis. I mean, I would say that has not always been the case for all analysis, but I think that now there is a much more widespread understanding that gender is not the only axis of inequalities, and that people who have multiple marginalized identities suffer from like overlapping inequalities. So I think that nowadays there is a much more understanding that we need to understand that everyone has different experience, and that should be addressed and taken into account in designing economic policy.
So what are some key feminist economics theories?
What do you mean exactly?
So what is the theory that when you start looking into feminist economics comes up a lot, or where do you start when you start learning about this topic?
So I would say that we had a lot of different feminist economic theories, and in many cases they kind of relate to like prior understanding of what feminism is, or what's the main problem regarding gender inequality, what's the source of the inequality. And we could kind of relate those theories to those that prevail in feminism in general. So for instance, we might have liberal feminists who think that the main issue is that women do not have the same opportunities as men, and that we just need to provide everyone with the same opportunity, with the same education, and the same capacity to decide their own destinies. And that would be enough to correct gender inequalities. We could also see a lot of feminists who are more connected with what we can call radical feminism, that see patriarchy as the main issue, or the patriarchal system as the main issue oppressing women, and saying that, well, giving the same opportunity is not enough because the system as a whole is designed for the male experience. We cannot just integrate women into that. While, for instance, Marxist feminists might think that class is kind of the main issue or the main axis of oppression, and they would have within Marxist feminism a lot of discussion of how class and gender interact and which one is kind of the primary of they are both, or if they are both very interrelated, and how to tackle this issue. So there are a lot of interesting theories, a lot of interesting research, and a lot of interesting thought behind feminism and feminist economics.
So then I want to dive a bit more into what you do as research, because you said that indicators shape the way we think. What do you mean by that?
So as I said, broadly speaking, my research is about the role of indicators as what I would call technologies of global governance, which in simple terms is what I said, that how indicators shape the way we think about things and the way and what we think we can do about them. So perhaps a good example could be development. So I think we can all agree that development is a very complex or even contested concept. We have been discussing what development is, how development is achieved. So there is no agreement on that. And that is very acknowledged, I guess. And there is, I would say, at least there for the last year, there is agreement that it's not just economic growth. There is more on development than economic growth. But when we see how the indicators that measure or attempt to measure development, we see that most of them, unsurprisingly, rely heavily on GDP growth as a major component. So these two terms kind of become conflated. And I think this is very problematic on itself, because you're putting forward one specific theory or one specific vision of the subject, but kind of isolating or shielding it from political dispute, because you are not saying okay, this is what I think, we can discuss this. You're saying, oh, this is an objective indicator. This is objectively measuring development, even though you are kind of putting forward your own ideas and that development is heavily related to economic growth. But which, as I said, I think it's a problem on itself. But I think there is another dimension, is that we live in a society where evidence-based decision-making has become more and more prominent. So people, and particularly decision makers, make decisions that seek to conform with those indicators, because they will be compensated or punished depending on their performance on those. So if you're a policymaker and you think that, I don't know, providing good, high quality health service to all of your citizens has more to do with development than GDP, it would be really hard for you to kind of advocate for your ideas if your country is going to be evaluated, their performance of your country is going to be evaluated mostly by their performance on GDP growth. So all in all, I think that indicators are a very powerful tool of global governance nowadays, and as such are worth studying. Now, I would say this is more of a framework or an area of study than a dissertation topic, of course. So my particular research explores how indicators shape what we think women's economic empowerment is and how it is achieved. And I do this by focusing on the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and their indicator framework. So just for those who might not be familiar with them, the SDGs are a collection of 17 comprehensive universal thematic goals that aim to guide policy decisions toward achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions, which are economic, social, and environmental. They were adopted by the UN member states in 2015 and are in force. And I'm doing air quotes here until 2030. And I'm doing air quotes because they're not binding in nature. But as I mentioned before, like these kind of frameworks with like indicators that measure progress and allow us to evaluate performance can be very influential tools in terms of how governments define policy priorities and allocate resources. And I would say that the SDGs have been celebrated as a major improvement towards a more comprehensive and perhaps progressive understanding of development, including how it deals with gender equality. And although there is some truth in that, I would kind of qualify those conclusions because I think that when we look at the indicator framework, and in particular to those related to gender equality, which is what, as I said, countries consider to guide their actions at the end of the day, the conceptualization that they offer of women's economic empowerment is not that different and not that much better from what we already had.
So what do we measure and what is missing in it?
Well, that's a thesis question. So I think that the indicator, again, like the indicator framework is too constrained, but what we already can measure. I think that there have been like a lot of efforts, particularly by UN Women, to try to get more or better statistics and not be constrained, but by what you already measure, which is again a major constraint because as you can probably imagine, what we already measure is what we already thought that was important. So it's really hard to challenge the status quo if you're always staying within what you already know, what you already measure. So, and you always receive so much pressure about like, oh, there's no money, there's no statistical capacity. So it is a very serious constraint. Just to give you like an example, I did write a paper recently about how unpaid care work is addressed in the SDG framework, which is not part of my thesis, but is kind of related. And I find that even though, well, the inclusion of unpaid care work in the SDGs is like a huge achievement. I think it's the first or one of the first like global development instruments that address unpaid care work, which was not a thing for the MDGs, which was the Millennium Development Goals that were before. So it is a big deal and it is very progressive that we have language there. However, when you see like the target, you hear a lot about like investing resources and created infrastructure, like really important things for improving how unpaid care work is distributed, not only between men and women, but also between like the household and the state. So we have a lot of really good language, but when you go to the indicators, you only see that they care about how it is distributed between men and women, which again, it is a big deal. But how much time in total you have to allocate to unpaid care work because the availability or the unavailability of public services, it is also a crucial issue and something that feminist economists have been highlighting for years. And I think that using that indicator kind of leaves governments off the hook, because they can say, oh, we're trying to push for cultural reforms so men take on more care work, which is fine and it is important and it is necessary, but they don't have to invest in creating care services so children have a place to go regardless of their parents' availability or their parents' ability to pay for that. They are not creating hospitals, they're not giving more parental leave. So it kind of leaves governments, I would say, off the hook. They just can have to say that they are trying to, I don't know, promote cultural change. And I think that's just not enough. And I think we have demonstrated that this approach of saying that you are promoting feminist measures, but then not doing anything other than just saying, oh, I love gender equality or let's empower women, but then not doing anything about that. That's really not enough.
So what would be a first step of something they could do?
I mean, I would say investing. Well, first of all, I would say very evaluating their budgets from a gender perspective. There is a lot of demand within feminist economics and feminist movement for gender responsive budgeting, which is that when you create your budgets, you have to consider where the resources are going, but also how the resources are obtained affect women and men separately. It's the same, for instance, with taxes. Like, it is not the same if your taxes come primarily from value-added taxes that if they come from income taxes, because the latter, like, it's more progressive, and we already know that, but it's also better in terms of like gender allocation. And it is the same in terms of how do you spend it. So if you have, I don't know, like a lot of expenditure on defense or on military spending, but then you are cutting expenses on like health, on education, that's not very good in gender terms, not in human terms, I would say.
So you have a background in labor economics and applied labor economics. How does that help you when it comes to feminist economics?
I think it's more the other way around.
Interesting. Why?
I think that having a background in feminist economics helped you when doing labor economics analysis, because for a similar reason or in a similar vein of what I just said, I think that when you carry out an analysis that doesn't take into account like that it's not feminist in nature, then you kind of fail to see the whole picture. So we see, for instance, that for decades now, I could say, like, everyone has acknowledged gender inequalities in the labor market. That's something that it's very easy to see by absolutely everyone. But the thing is that the policies that many of these organizations have proposed have been very ineffective. They're like, oh, why don't women work more hours? And the thing is that when you see how many hours women do work, because you add the time that they work within the household, you see that women are working a lot, certainly a lot more than men on average. So if you completely miss part of the picture and say, oh, why don't women want to work 9 hours a day? You're missing that they're already working 9 or more hours a day. And you're kind of, I don't know, promoting policies that are not helping anyone, because those incentives are meaningless if you don't tackle the root of the problem, which is the unequal distribution of unpaid care work.
So with every guest, we have a little lightning round. I ask a question and you just say the first thing that comes up. Okay?
Okay. Let's see.
This is a skill any economist should learn.
Oh, this is an easy one, qualitative research.
Who do you admire or look up to in economics?
I would say my personal mentors and idols, Corina Rodriguez Enriquez and Radhika Balakrishnan.
What is a question you want me to ask that I haven't asked you yet?
Oh, this is, I don't know.
So where can people learn about the things that you're enthusiastic about if they want to learn more?
Well, I'll take a couple of minutes to answer this, or 1 minute. So the first one is that if people are just starting with feminist economics or gender and economics and they know nothing about this, I would definitely recommend to check the Young Scholars Initiative Gender and Economics Working Group. I'm a coordinator there, and we have a working group working on all things gender and economics. We have carried out a lot of webinars, and they can see the recording. And this is a very introductory space to learn more about feminist economics. If they do know a little bit more, I would encourage everyone to get involved with IAFI, which is the International Association for Feminist Economics and the Feminist Economics Journal. And myself, I'm always happy to guide people who are interested and do not know how to start. And you can find me, as I said, on Twitter.
Awesome. So what do you want to say to future economists?
I would say that ask yourself frequently, what is the goal of your work or the work you do, and who is it serving? Not to say that you always need to know exactly where you're going, but I think it's good to have a north, and that the good north is supporting an economy that enables everyone to live a meaningful life.
And final question, what does the future of economics look like according to you?
Well, the future is female. No, just kidding. But hopefully it will be feminist. It will be sustainable. It will be decolonial, multicultural, etc.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Rethinking Podcast. Hit the follow button on your platform so that you'll stay up to date with all we have in store for you. You can also find Rethinking Economics NL on social media. Just click the links down below. Until next time, we'll rethink again soon.